Now, the final question, I don't have the time that I would like to answer this in depth, but I'll just give a very brief answer. And that is, was Augustine and Aquinas, as mentioned here as well, were they double predestinarian or were they single predestinarians? And this can be a broader question used in terms of the entire Augustinian tradition, because Augustine does use terminology of double predestination. And that terminology is taken up by those within the Augustinian tradition, and you can find it in Aquinas, but you can find it in many others as well in that period between Augustine and Aquinas, where you have Fulgentius of Rust, Prosper of Aquitaine, Thomas Gottschalk, who gets himself into a lot of trouble, and Lupus de Ferrier, and many others. So there is a very strong Augustinian strand of theology that just extends throughout the history of the Western Church. It's always been there. And double predestination has always been a part of that. I think it's a difficult question, though, because the question is, what does that mean? Because we think of double predestination, you think in terms of Calvinism, double predestinarian Calvinism. Even when you're talking about double predestinarian Calvinism, there are very big differences between a supralapsarian and an infralapsarian view. And I have a video on that if you want to check that out, that explains those differences. But there is a difference between various even Calvinistic views of double predestination. So it's hard to say just without qualification, yes, they were double predestinarian. Now, Augustine himself speaks primarily about a predestination unto life. He's really dealing more so with the issue of the extent of sin, original sin, the necessity of grace, because this is the Pelagian controversy that brings this out, where Pelagius is arguing that there's no such thing as inherited sin and guilt, but that instead we are basically born morally free agents. We can obey the law perfectly throughout our lives if we desire to. Augustine says, no, we are born in sin. There is a necessity of grace to regenerate, to save. We can't do anything apart from that grace. And so predestination comes in that context. It's not for Augustine in the context of an abstract discussion of, and maybe I shouldn't just say abstract, because people always accuse things of being abstract, but and I say that because when I'm talking about philosophy, people always tell me, oh, you're just being abstract, but I don't know. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. But the point is, it's not a discussion primarily about compatibilism, determinism, the relationship between God's sovereignty and human will. It gets into those questions, but that's not the focus for Augustine. So Augustine's not just kind of theorizing about different aspects of God's will and what double predestination means. And so I don't think, well, Calvin's certainly influenced by Augustine in a lot of strong ways. I don't think you definitely can't argue for a supralapsarian double predestinarianism in Augustine. And I think when this double predestination shows up in Augustine, he doesn't really explain that language much at all. And that's some of the difficulty when you're looking at Augustine on that topic, is because he's really talking about the positive side of it and the necessity of grace. You'll see language of a kind of double predestination, but you don't really know what he means by that. And it merits a lot of further explanation. And the explanation of Augustine isn't going to come till later, so that gets pretty tough. What you do find, though, is you do have guys like St. Prosper of Aquitaine and St. Fulgentius of Rust, and Fulgentius uses double predestinarian language. Prosper does too at first, then he rejects it for a single predestination. So you see the Augustinian tradition as a whole has a trajectory of moving away from at least a harsh double predestinarianism. And in Fulgentius, he uses the language of a double predestination, but then he defines what he means by it, and it's not what you necessarily think of as double predestination. And Martin Chemnitz actually cites this in the examination, and he even affirms what Fulgentius says, though he wouldn't himself prefer to use those terms because of the way that they're used within Calvinism. But Fulgentius, when he is describing this double predestinarianism, and his works can be found in Catholic University of America Press puts up this Church Fathers series, and there's a thick volume of Fulgentius's writings on semi-Pelagianism, where he talks about some of this, and Trinitarianism as well. All his works are really worthwhile, very much strongly within the Augustinian tradition. So within his writings, when he defines that negative aspect of predestination, he's very clear that they're not the same, that a positive predestination unto life is a totally unmerited thing of God's grace. But predestination unto damnation is only in view of God foreseeing man's future sins and future rejection of the gospel. And so one is only damned because they have rejected the gospel. But that negative you could say, this isn't election to life based on foreseen faith, but you could say it's election unto damnation based on foreseen unfaith or unbelief and rejection of the gospel. So it doesn't. So if you look elsewhere in Fulgentius, he's pretty clear that God desires all to be saved. And I know within Calvinism, there are differences in terms of how that's understood. But I don't think he even gets to totally an infralapsarian view either, because it's not just God passing over those individuals. It's God foreseeing that they are going to actively reject the grace that he offers them. And then in view of that, predestines not really the individuals themselves, but predestines the punishment that is hell, that is damnation for unbelief. So the language sounds doubly predestinarian, but the question is that really what they mean? Now, I definitely don't think you can find a Calvinistic double predestination in Aquinas. There is a single predestinarianism there. I could get into quotes from all of these church fathers. I'm only not, because I'm at the end here and I don't have time. But I can recommend Guido Stucco, who is an author he's a Roman Catholic. He's dealt with the questions of predestination, semi-Pelagianism, Pelagian controversies beyond Augustine, and he's got a set three separate volumes, and one deals with the Church Fathers, then one deals with the Middle Ages, and then he goes to later Roman Catholicism with the Council of Trent. And I think he has a pretty fair treatment. I think it's pretty accurate, and I from my reading of the sources, I come to pretty much the same conclusions that he's come to. So I would check those out. Also, I know I keep recommending articles that I've written. I do not want to be obnoxious, but since I did write an article on Prosper of Aquitaine and CFW Walther and the similarities between their views, which gets into this question as well. You can find that on my website too, jordanbcooper.com. So if you're curious and want to read a little more about that particular topic.